The morning light was just beginning to spill over the windowsill, painting a soft, golden stripe across the worn wooden floor of Adeline's small apartment. It was a quiet, unassuming Tuesday, the kind of day that promised nothing more than the gentle rhythm of routine. She was nursing a cup of black coffee, the steam warming her face as she looked out at the sleepy city below. For the past 5 years, her life had been a carefully constructed fortress of solitude and predictability. Anonymity was her shield, and quiet was her peace. Then the phone rang. It wasn't her work phone, nor the cheap burner she kept for emergencies. It was the other one, the one that had remained silent for so long she sometimes forgot it existed, tucked away in a dusty drawer. A ghost. The screen was black, the number blocked, but Adeline didn't need to see a name to know who it was. A cold dread, familiar as an old scar, prickled at the back of her neck. Her hand was perfectly steady as she raised the phone to her ear. "Hello?" she said, her voice a calm, even tone that betrayed none of the sudden chaos in her chest. The voice on the other end was smooth, laced with a chilling confidence that was both arrogant and disarmingly polite. "Good morning, Adeline. I do hope I'm not calling at a bad time." She didn't answer. There was no point in pleasantries. "We just wanted to inform you," the voice continued, a hint of amusement coloring the words, "that we've emptied your storage unit. The one at All Safe Storage, Unit 3B. It was quite a task, I must say. You have a lot of things." Adeline's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on her wall, a faded image of a man with kind eyes and a warm smile, holding a small child's hand. Elias. A lifetime ago. The world seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times, the precipice she had been living on the edge of for half a decade. She could feel the man on the other end of the line. Julian, she was sure of it, savoring the silence, imagining her panic, her desperation. He was expecting tears, or threats, or begging. He would get none of it. Adeline took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. It was lukewarm now. "Check again," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of solid steel. That one was a decoy. The silence on the other end of the line was more satisfying than any shout of anger could ever have been. It stretched for a full 3 seconds, an eternity in a conversation measured in heartbeats. Adeline could almost picture Julian's face, the smug certainty melting away into a frown of confusion, then hardening into disbelief. He had been so sure of his victory, so convinced of her weakness. When he finally spoke, the silky smoothness was gone, replaced by a raw, guttural edge. "What did you say?" Adeline didn't give him the courtesy of a repeat. She pressed the end call button, the small red icon a definitive full stop to their exchange. The phone was placed gently back in the drawer. Its job done. The ghost could go back to sleep. For a moment, the apartment was silent again, the only sound the distant hum of city traffic. Adeline stood motionless, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. Her calm facade was a dam, and behind it, a torrent of adrenaline raged. A single slow breath escaped her lips. Then another. She knew what Julian's men would be sifting through. Boxes upon boxes of her mother's old paperback novels, a worn-out armchair with a faded floral pattern, stacks of vinyl records from a bygone era, kitchenware she'd never used. It was the complete, convincing history of a life. Just not her life. It was a shell, painstakingly assembled over 5 years, a breadcrumb trail designed to lead nowhere. Julian had seen the records of her payments, the address, the unit number, and had assumed he'd found her heart. He had only found her camouflage. They had underestimated her. They always did. They saw the quiet librarian, the woman who kept to herself, who bought groceries on Tuesdays and returned her library books on Fridays. They didn't see the shadow Elias had trained her to be. They didn't see the woman who had spent years learning to be invisible in plain sight. But the decoy wouldn't fool them for long. Julian was arrogant, but not stupid. Once the initial shock wore off, his anger would give way to a cold, calculated fury. They would analyze the contents, realize the personal effects were too generic, too impersonal. They would re-examine her digital footprint, her physical habits, and they would see the gaps. And then they would come for her. The quiet apartment was no longer a fortress, it was a trap. Adeline pushed away from the counter, her movements fluid and economical. The time for stillness was over. The time for running had begun. She walked to her bedroom closet, past the simple clothes she wore every day, and pressed a section of the back wall. A panel clicked open, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a worn leather satchel, a passport with a name she hadn't used in years, and a set of keys. These keys were not for a car or a house. They were for a place that didn't officially exist, the real prize. It was the last promise she had made to Elias, whispered in the sterile, antiseptic air of a hospital room as his time ran out. "Protect it, Addie," he had rasped, his hand weak in hers. "Don't let them find it. Don't let them win." And she would not fail. With the satchel slung over her shoulder, a familiar weight that was both a burden and a comfort, Adeline moved with a purpose that was terrifying in its efficiency. There was no frantic packing, no sentimental last looks at the life she had so carefully curated. Everything she truly needed, everything that was real, was in that bag. The apartment, her job, her very name, it was all just another storage unit, a larger, more elaborate decoy she was now ready to abandon without a second thought. She went to the bathroom and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Not for vanity, but for a cold assessment. The face looking back was a masterful creation of blandness. Plain, forgettable. It was a face she had practiced wearing for 5 years, a mask of mediocrity that allowed her to move through the world unseen. She pulled her mousy brown hair back from its severe bun, a style chosen specifically because it was unflattering, and let it fall loose around her shoulders. The simple act changed the shape of her face, softening her jawline. From the satchel, she retrieved a pair of non-prescription glasses with thick black frames. Elias had always said that glasses were the most underrated tool of misdirection. They made people look at your eyes but not see your face. Lastly, she shed the drab, loose-fitting cardigan and blouse, the uniform of her fabricated life, revealing a simple, dark gray t-shirt beneath. The woman in the mirror was no longer Adeline the librarian. She was a stranger, a ghost shedding one skin for another. She didn't take the elevator or the front stairs. Those were the obvious paths, the ones Julian's men would be watching first. Instead, she walked to the end of the hallway, to a maintenance closet that was supposed to be perpetually locked. Her key, however, was not a standard one. It was a masterfully crafted skeleton key, one of Elias's many talents, and it turned the lock with a nearly inaudible click. Inside, among the buckets and the sharp scent of bleach, was a small, grimy window that led out onto a rusting fire escape overlooking a back alley. The metal groaned under her weight, a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden quiet of her escape. She froze, pressing herself against the cold brick of the building. Below, the alley was filled with the mundane sounds of the city, the clang of a dumpster lid, the distant wail of a siren. She descended with a practiced ease, her feet finding the steps without her needing to look down, her hands grazing the gritty, cold metal of the railing. It was a dance she and Elias had practiced countless times on a similar structure he had built in a warehouse years ago. Once her feet hit the cracked pavement, she didn't run. Elias's voice was a whisper in her memory. Running is an invitation. You walk. You blend. Let the city swallow you. She became part of the anonymous river of people flowing through the city's veins. She walked 2 blocks east, away from the nearest subway station, and boarded a bus heading uptown. On the bus, she didn't hide her face or stare at the floor. She watched the reflections in the bus window, her eyes scanning not just for threats, but for patterns. She analyzed the faces of the people on the street, the cars idling at the lights, searching for anyone who didn't belong, anyone whose gaze lingered a fraction of a second too long. A man in a dark coat seemed to be looking in her direction, and for a heart-stopping moment their eyes met in the reflection. Her pulse quickened, but she held his gaze in the glass, her expression placid, until he looked away, bored. After a dozen blocks, she got off, walked a block north, and descended into the chaotic embrace of the subway. She let 2 crowded trains pass, standing near a pillar, seemingly engrossed in a discarded newspaper. It was a test. If anyone was tailing her, they would be forced to reveal themselves, to linger too long on the platform. No one did. On the 3rd train, she stepped in just as the doors were chiming their warning to close. She rode for 3 stops, then switched to a different line, heading back downtown, a 40-minute journey to travel 10 blocks. It was tedious, disorienting, and absolutely necessary. Her destination was a part of the city that seemed to have been forgotten by progress, a narrow street lined with old brick buildings. Their ground floors were occupied by locksmiths, shoe repair shops, and dusty antique stores that smelled of mothballs and time. She stopped in front of a shop with a faded peeling sign that read, Elias's Horologicals, a place for fixing clocks. It had been officially closed for 5 years, ever since Elias had passed. The windows were opaque with a thick layer of city grime, a shroud that protected its contents from prying eyes. To anyone else, it was just another abandoned storefront, a relic of a dead man. To Adeline, it was the only safe place she had left in the world. She slipped into the recessed doorway, her body instantly hidden from the street. One of the keys from her satchel, cold and solid in her hand, was for the heavy-duty lock at the bottom of the door. The other was for the deadbolt above it. Each turned with a quiet, satisfying thud. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, opening into a world of shadow and stillness. The air inside was cool and carried the scent of aged wood, brass, and clock oil. It was the scent of her childhood, of safety, of Elias. She stepped inside, closing the heavy door behind her. The click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the first breath she'd truly taken since the phone rang. The outside world, with all its noise and all its dangers, was gone. Inside the clock shop, time itself seemed to have stopped. Or rather, it existed in 1,000 different measures all at once. The gentle, rhythmic ticking of dozens of clocks filled the air, a soft, mechanical heartbeat that Adeline felt more than she heard. It was a sound that had been the lullaby of her youth. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the grimy front windows, illuminating a world of intricate machinery and patient craftsmanship. The main room was just as Elias had left it. A long wooden workbench ran along one wall, its surface scarred with the history of his trade. Tiny brass gears, delicate hands, and complex tools lay in organized chaos, as if he had just stepped out for a moment. On the opposite wall, shelves reached toward the ceiling, crowded with clocks of every conceivable shape and size. There were ornate mantel clocks, stoic wall clocks, and whimsical cuckoo clocks, their carved birds frozen mid-call. Some were ticking faithfully, a testament to their maker's skill. Others were silent. Their hands paused at the exact moment their springs had wound down, marking not the time of day, but the day Elias's time had run out. Adeline allowed herself a single, fleeting moment to grieve. Her fingers traced the edge of the workbench, the wood smooth beneath her touch. She could almost see him there, his brow furrowed in concentration, a magnifying loupe fixed to his eye. He was a man who understood the mechanics of time better than anyone, and he had used every second of his own to prepare her for this. "Every lock has a key, Addie," he used to say, "and every system has a weakness. You just have to know how to look for it." She wasn't here for nostalgia. She walked past the workbench, past the silent waiting clocks, to the back of the shop. Standing there, like a silent sentinel, was a magnificent grandfather clock, its dark mahogany case gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was Elias's masterpiece, the first one he had ever built from scratch. It didn't tell the time. Its face was a complex astrolabe of suns and moons, and its hands had not moved in 20 years. Adeline knelt before it. There was no visible keyhole, no seam or latch. To anyone else, it was a beautiful, non-functional antique, but Adeline knew its secret. She pressed her fingers against the ornate carvings on its base, not in a sequence but with a specific rhythmic pressure, mimicking the cadence of a particular lullaby Elias used to hum. Tap, 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 tap. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, satisfying thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, a section of the clock's base slid silently inward, revealing not a compartment, but a single, unadorned brass keyhole. She took another key from her satchel, this one different from the others, heavier and more complex. As she inserted it and turned, she didn't hear the click of a lock, but the whirring of internal gears. A section of the wall behind the grandfather clock swung inward, revealing a doorway into a small, climate-controlled vault. This was the real storage unit. Inside, there were no dusty paperbacks or old furniture. There were rows of metal shelves, and on them a series of locked hard-shell cases. Adeline did not need to open them. She knew their contents by heart. She walked to the farthest shelf, to a case that was smaller than the others, and placed her hand flat upon its cold surface. Everything she had done, the 5 years of isolation, the life she had sacrificed, was for this. Julian and his employers believed they were hunting for a fortune, a weapon, or a piece of blackmail. They were wrong. What was hidden here was far more dangerous, and far more important. It was a legacy, a truth. She didn't take the case. Not yet. First, she had to see how the board was being played. She had poked the hornet's nest. Now, she would wait for the hornets to show her where they would swarm. The vault was not just a hiding place. It was a command center in hibernation. Adeline ignored the sealed cases for now. Her immediate priority was intelligence. On the far wall of the vault, beneath a ventilation unit, was a steel panel. She opened it to reveal a compact fold-down desk and a hardened laptop encased in a custom-built Faraday cage. This was Elias's digital sanctum. As the laptop booted up, It bypassed a conventional operating system, loading a minimalist, text-based interface that existed on a closed network. There was no desktop, no icons, only a single blinking cursor awaiting a command. Adeline's fingers flew across the keyboard, typing a string of alphanumeric code that was less a password and more a cryptographic key. Her first move was to check the eyes she had left behind. She accessed a secure, low-bandwidth video feed from a micro camera hidden in a fake smoke detector in the hallway of her old apartment building. The image was grainy but clear enough. Two men stood outside her door, not in uniform, but their posture, their alert stillness, screamed law enforcement or something far more disciplined. They weren't trying to get in. They were securing the scene. A moment later, two more men appeared, carrying a case of specialized electronics. Julian wasn't just sending thugs, he was sending forensics. She switched her focus. Another command brought up a program Elias had called The Ghost. It was a sophisticated web of false trails, encrypted servers, and looping data that constituted the entire digital life of Adeline. For 5 years, it had dutifully paid her bills from a dozen different ghost accounts, filed her taxes, and even renewed her library card online. Now, Adeline initiated a diagnostic, a silent alarm system that would tell her if any part of that web was being aggressively probed. While the diagnostic ran, her eyes fell upon a single, isolated folder on the directory. The folder was named For a Rainy Day. She hesitated for only a second before opening it. It contained a single video file. She clicked it. Elias's face filled the screen. He looked older, more tired than she remembered, the lines on his face etched deeper by the illness that would soon claim him. But his eyes were the same, sharp, kind, and fiercely intelligent. He was in his workshop, the familiar ticking of the clocks a soft chorus in the background. "Hello, Addie," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "If you're watching this, then the quiet days are over, and I am so sorry for that. I hope it was a long time. I hope you got some peace." He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Don't waste time grieving me again. We did that already. Now you work the problem. The system I built for you will hold, but nothing is unbreakable. They will look for you. Julian will not stop. What you are protecting, it undoes everything he has built. It's not about revenge, Addie. It's about the truth. It deserves a voice. Now get to work. I'm proud of you." The video ended, leaving Adeline staring at her own reflection in the dark screen. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a luxury she hadn't allowed herself until now. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her resolve hardening like steel. A soft chime from the laptop brought her back to the present. The diagnostic was complete. A map of her digital network appeared on the screen, a sprawling web of green lines indicating secure connections. But in one corner, a single node was flashing a persistent, angry red. It wasn't her finances or her identity that was under attack. It was something far more personal, something she hadn't anticipated. Julian wasn't just searching for Adeline the librarian. He was running a deep-level data probe on the city's hospital records, specifically looking for patients who had died of Elias's rare form of cancer 5 years ago. He was hunting for a connection, for a grieving daughter, a friend, a next of kin. He was no longer hunting the woman she was. He was hunting the woman she used to be. The anger that rose in Adeline was not hot, but icy and sharp. It was the cold fury of a sacred place being desecrated. Her quiet life, her anonymity, that was a fortress she had built for this fight, and she was willing to sacrifice it. But Elias, his memory, the final painful days of his life, that was holy ground. For Julian to trample upon it, to use her grief as a weapon against her, was a line that could not be uncrossed. Elias's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't get angry, get creative. Anger is a flood. Creativity is a river. One destroys the landscape, the other carves a new path." Adeline's fingers returned to the keyboard, her movements now imbued with a fierce, new intensity. Julian was looking for a needle in a haystack, so she would give him more hay. A mountain of it. She accessed another of Elias's custom programs, this one named The Weaver. It was a tool of digital fabrication, designed not to erase data, an act that leaves a conspicuous void, but to create it. It could spin convincing, intricate lies and weave them seamlessly into the fabric of existing databases. Her target was the hospital's 5-year-old archive. With meticulous care, Adeline began to weave. She created a ghost, a phantom nurse named Sarah Jenkins, who had supposedly been on duty during Elias's final weeks. She fabricated digital time cards, chat logs with other nurses about the kind old clockmaker in room 4B, Even a record of a small, anonymous donation made to the hospital's charity fund in Nurse Jenkins's name a month after Elias passed. It was a perfect dead end, a trail designed to waste weeks of Julian's resources as his team tried to track down a woman who never existed. Next, she moved on to the visitor logs. She added 3 new names, all generic, all untraceable. But then she did something more. She found the digital file for Elias's next of kin information. It was empty, as she had instructed years ago. But now she added a single entry. She fabricated a grieving ex-wife who had moved to a remote town in Oregon 2 decades prior. She gave her a name, a manufactured credit history, and even a social media profile that had been dormant for the last 3 years. It was another trail, another ghost for Julian to chase across the country. While the Weaver ran its complex subroutines, Adeline initiated a trace on the incoming probe. It was a risky move, a digital dance where one misstep could reveal her own location. Elias's software was superior, but Julian's team was clearly well-funded and competent. The trace program, which Elias had called the Ferret, began to map the query's path backward through the internet's labyrinthine corridors. It bounced through proxies in 3 different countries, a standard obfuscation technique. But then it hit a firewall. Not a commercial one, but a proprietary corporate network. The Ferret couldn't break through it, but it could read the name on the wall. The query that was digging into her past, the hunt that was being orchestrated by Julian, was originating from behind the digital fortress of a multinational corporation, the Sterling Group. Adeline stared at the name on the screen. The Sterling Group, a massive, faceless conglomerate with interests in logistics, technology, and private security. They were a global power, seemingly untouchable, their public face one of bland corporate success. Julian wasn't just a rogue agent. He was a high-level executive, a wolf cloaked in the sheep's wool of a corporate entity. The game had changed. She wasn't just fighting a man anymore. She was fighting an empire. And now, she knew its name. The satisfaction of this discovery was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She was no longer just the hunted. She was the one who knew their secret. Staring at the name on the screen, the Sterling Group, was like looking into the face of a kraken that had just surfaced from the deep. The scale of the fight had changed so profoundly that fear was a useless emotion. What replaced it was a stark, clarifying calm. She could never defeat an entity like Sterling. She couldn't outrun them forever, nor could she fight them on their terms. Elias had known that. "You can't slay the dragon, Addie," he had once told her, his hand steady as he adjusted a tiny escapement wheel. "But you can turn on the lights and show everyone that the dragon is there. And dragons hate the light. The time for hiding was over. The time for protecting the legacy was over. It was time to use it." Adeline turned back to the vault, her steps echoing in the quiet chamber. She walked to the small, unassuming case on the farthest shelf and unlocked it with a final key from her satchel. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was not a weapon, not gold, not jewels. It was a set of old, leather-bound ledgers and a single military-grade encrypted data drive. Before he was a humble clockmaker, Elias had been a senior auditor for the Sterling Group. He was the man they brought in to find the flaws in their own systems, and he had found one. A massive criminal conspiracy buried deep within their corporate structure, a project that had siphoned billions and had cost lives. The ledgers and the drive contained the original, untampered evidence, the irrefutable truth of the dragon's crimes. He had escaped with it, and they had hunted him ever since, framing him for the very crimes he had uncovered. His illness was the only thing that had stopped them from finding him sooner. Adeline connected the drive to the laptop. Using Elias's network, she began the final sequence. She didn't send the files to the police or any government agency. Sterling's tentacles were too deep. Instead, she composed a single anonymous email and sent the entire decrypted package to a carefully curated list of 3 of the world's most fiercely independent and notoriously stubborn investigative journalists. People who couldn't be bought, threatened, or silenced. As the final data packet uploaded, its journey to the light now irreversible, Adeline did one last thing. She picked up the burner phone, the one from the ghost drawer, and dialed the last number that had called her. Julian answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and laced with fury. "Where are you?" he snarled. "Does it matter?" Adeline replied, her voice calm. It was the same tone she had used that morning, but now it was not a facade. It was real. "I just wanted to let you know, Julian. You were looking in the wrong place. You were hunting for a ghost, but you should have been looking for the truth. It's out now. All of it. The ledgers, The project data, Elias's testimony, everything. The silence on the other end was profound. Adeline could hear the faint sound of his breathing, the frantic calculations happening in his mind as he realized what she had done. He was no longer a predator cornering his prey. He was just a man on a sinking ship. "You have no idea what you've done," he whispered, his voice hollow. "I know exactly what I've done," she said softly. "I kept a promise." She ended the call and removed the battery from the phone. Her work was done. She wiped the laptop's drives, initiating a self-corrupting sequence that would turn Elias's digital sanctum into nothing but electronic dust. She packed the original ledgers and the drive back into their case. They were her life insurance now, and her burden. Adeline walked out of the vault, leaving the door open. She didn't look back at the ticking clocks or the silent workbench. She closed the heavy front door of the horological shop, the click of the lock a final quiet farewell. Stepping out into the late afternoon, she blended once more into the river of nameless faces, a ghost again. But this time she was not running in fear. She was a woman who had carried the weight of a promise, and in fulfilling it, had found a quiet, solitary, and profound freedom. Her future was a blank page, but the story of Elias and the truth he died to protect was finally being told.